Thomas Farrow lived his life in deliberate anonymity. His existence was as unremarkable as the town he called home, a quiet place in the Midwest where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. A modest, two-bedroom house at the end of a nondescript cul-de-sac served as his sanctuary. He worked as an accountant at a small firm, the kind of job that kept him invisible but paid enough for him to live comfortably. He didn't make waves, didn't complain, and kept to himself in a way that most found polite but distant. For the outside world, Thomas was the embodiment of decency, quiet, reliable, kind. He greeted neighbors with a nod, held doors open for strangers, and never forgot to tip generously when he dined out alone at the local diner. He went to work, did his job, came home. He attended no social gatherings, avoided office parties, and made no effort to form close relationships. People chalked it up to him being a private person. And privacy was something people respected. It made him forgettable. Which was exactly what he wanted. Beneath the surface of this quiet, gentle man, however, raged a mind consumed by hatred, a deep and irrepressible disdain for humanity. Thomas was not embittered by a singular tragic event, nor had he been abused or mistreated. His anger wasn't the result of personal loss or misfortune. Rather, it was an intellectual revulsion, a philosophy of contempt for the human race that had taken root and grown steadily throughout his life. He loathed the noise, the waste, the shallow, self-serving nature of people. The way they lied to themselves and each other, pretending they were good, while their hearts were as black as the deepest night. Thomas saw through them, all of them. To him, humanity was a disease, parasitic, corrupt, and rotting from within. The irony of it all was that no one suspected a thing. Thomas made sure of that. He was meticulous in everything he did, leaving no trace of his true feelings, and certainly no trace of what he did to satisfy the monster inside him. Thomas's murders were infrequent, sporadic acts that never followed a clear pattern. He selected his victims not for any personal reason, but for their inconspicuousness. They were the forgotten, the invisible, runaways, the homeless, travelers with no connections. He was careful, so very careful, to never choose anyone who would be missed by the world. The authorities might investigate, might even find the bodies, but there would be no one to raise an alarm. No one to cry out for justice. And in the end, nothing to link the crimes together. He kept his urges in check for long stretches of time, sometimes years. But when the desire to rid the world of one more filthy creature overtook him, he acted with precision and restraint. The act of killing wasn't an emotional release for him. It was not driven by rage, nor was it about power. It was, to Thomas, a moral duty, an almost sacred ritual. He was systematic. Every aspect of his plan was calculated, practiced, rehearsed in his mind for weeks before he even thought of making a move. The tools he used were varied, chosen based on what was available and untraceable. His methods changed every time, a blunt instrument, a length of rope, a blade, but always executed with the same clinical detachment. His victims were simply removed, erased from the world, and in doing so, he believed he was making the earth just a little quieter. A little better. He left no evidence, no clues. His murders were flawless, and he took no pride in them, for pride implied a desire for recognition. Thomas desired nothing of the sort. He killed, not to be remembered, but because it aligned with the truth he had come to accept, that the world was better off without most of its inhabitants. And the fewer people who walked the earth, the more peace it brought him. Thomas had no friends, but that didn't bother him. He didn't want friends, didn't need them. Connections were messy, complicated, and he was a man who valued simplicity. The people who crossed his path thought of him as polite but distant, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to help if needed. If they had any idea of the thoughts that roiled beneath his placid exterior, they would have recoiled in horror. But they didn't know. They never would. The illusion of normalcy he had created was perfect. He worked his job with diligence, keeping his head down, never attracting attention. He kept a clean house, paid his bills on time, and maintained his car like clockwork. To the outside world, Thomas Farrow was the ideal neighbor. And that's why no one noticed when he disappeared for days at a time, slipping into the night like a shadow, only to return just as quietly. He wasn't missed, because no one truly knew him. He thought about the people who surrounded him sometimes, the neighbors with their petty complaints, the coworkers who gossiped about each other, the strangers he passed on the street who were always glued to their phones, oblivious to the world around them. In their endless noise, their shallow distractions, they were all so easily consumed by the mundane, unaware of the true ugliness that lay at the heart of the world. It amused him how they went about their lives, clinging to the illusion that everything had meaning. That their jobs, their families, their small triumphs and tragedies somehow mattered in the grand scheme of things. But Thomas knew the truth. Life had no intrinsic value. There was no purpose beyond the fleeting moments that made up a human existence, no reason to care about what would be left behind. And for him, that truth was freeing. He had no desire for legacy, no need for anyone to remember his name after he was gone. If he died tomorrow, the world would carry on as though he had never existed. The thought didn't bother him. In fact, he found it comforting. There was a certain peace in knowing that his life, his carefully controlled existence, would leave no lasting mark. The world was overcrowded with people desperate for recognition, for meaning. Thomas had none of that. He was content to fade into oblivion. But before that day came, there was still work to be done. It was on a cold autumn night that Thomas's resolve to act again took shape. He had been walking the streets, a rare indulgence, watching the crowds of people bustling about their lives, when he spotted a man sitting alone in an alley. The man was clearly homeless, his clothes tattered, his face weathered by years of hardship. He was an ideal target, invisible, forgotten, and vulnerable. Thomas didn't act right away. He never did. Instead, he watched, following the man from a distance, learning his habits, his routine. The man was predictable. Every night, he slept in the same spot, a makeshift bed of cardboard and old blankets tucked behind a row of dumpsters. He had no friends, no family, and no one who would come looking for him when he was gone. For weeks, Thomas observed, biding his time, waiting for the right moment. It was a game of patience, and Thomas excelled at it. When the moment came, it was perfect. The streets were empty, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Thomas approached the man, offering him a cigarette, a rare act of kindness that disarmed his prey. They talked for a while, about nothing, really. The man told Thomas about the hard times he'd fallen on, the bad decisions he'd made, the opportunities he'd squandered. Thomas listened, nodding politely, his face betraying none of the contempt that burned inside him. When the man finally closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep, Thomas made his move. It was quick, efficient. A length of rope, a steady hand, and the man was gone. Another forgotten soul erased from the world, another small step toward the peace Thomas sought. He left the body where it lay, knowing it would be days before anyone found it, if they found it at all. As Thomas walked away, the familiar sense of calm washed over him. The streets were quiet now, the noise of the city receding into the distance. He felt at peace, as he always did after one of his acts. The world, for a brief moment, felt a little less crowded, a little more bearable. Months passed, and Thomas continued his life of quiet anonymity. The world moved on around him, oblivious to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He went to work, paid his bills, and kept to himself, just as he always had. But as the years wore on, something began to shift. The peace he had once felt after each act of violence was becoming harder to find. The hatred that had once driven him, that had given his life meaning, was beginning to wane. Thomas realized that he was growing tired. The disdain he had once felt for humanity no longer burned as brightly. He still hated them, but the hatred had become dull, like a blade worn down from years of use. He found himself wondering if, perhaps, he had been wrong all along. If, in the end, his actions had been as meaningless as the lives he had taken. He had always believed that the world was better off without people, that his killings were a form of justice, a way to cleanse the earth of its filth. But now, as he sat alone in his empty house, the silence pressing in around him, he began to question whether any of it had mattered at all. The world had not changed. People were still the same, cruel, selfish, and shallow. And Thomas, for all his careful planning and meticulous actions, had made no difference. He was just one man, and when he was gone, the world would forget him, just as it had forgotten his victims. And in that realization, Thomas found a new kind of peace. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The hatred, the killings, the disdain, it was all part of the same meaningless existence that had plagued him for so long. In the end, life was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a brief flicker of consciousness before the void. And Thomas was ready for the void. He had no legacy to leave behind, no desire to be remembered. He was at peace with his mortality, with the inevitability of his own death. And when it came, as it surely would, he knew that the world would continue on without him, unchanged, indifferent. And that was exactly how it should be.